The imaginary Indian. The concept arises from colonialism. Through colonialism, the state wanted to assimilate the indigenous into European culture, and so they took away indigenous land, values, culture, and traditions. What is the imaginary Indian? It's a representation of indigenous peoples that governs our everyday experiences and behaviors. It allows inequality to occur in which we use these stereotypes in media, the film industry, and institutional areas. We assume that the imaginary Indian was this great person who was close to nature and was spiritual, one that held on to their traditions and lived a good life. We think that it is impossible for them to exist now because they cannot be modern.
From the mid-1800s until well into the 20th century, the belief of the generality of people was that natives were disappearing from the face of the earth.
Jacob, like other children in school, learned about Canada's Indigenous people in his history courses. When a girl in his class introduced herself as Indigenous, he was confused because she wore jeans and seemed like everyone else. "Don't you mean that your ancestors were Indigenous?" he asks. The assumption is that white culture can be improved over time but Indigenous culture can't.
Daniel Francis found this image was propagated by artists who felt the sense of urgency to preserve the Indian culture, missionaries of the 19th century who saw the Indians as a problem to be solved, and scholars of the 20th century who wrote that Indians were going to have to give up their pagan superstitions and embrace the white way. Francis writes, "The only image of the Indian presented to non-natives was therefore a historical one. The image could not be modernized." By the end of the 20th century, it was clear these beliefs could no longer be substantiated. Indigenous populations were growing, and Indigenous people were asserting themselves more and more strongly. As a result, Canadians wholeheartedly endorsed the assimilation of the Indian, which in the long run meant the same thing, an end to an identifiable Indian people.
Created using Powtoon.